everybody. I want to welcome you once again to Inside the Magic Circle. I'm Jason Augustus Newcomb. I'm speaking today with a woman named Harper Feist, who you may, if you follow my amazing career, you may have seen her in my 7-day Goetic grimoire class, giving some advice on scrying, and I'm sure we're going to talk about that a little bit more in this interview. She's also made a contribution to the recently published book Ceremonial Magic, published by Llewellyn. I think Lon Maladuquette is the main sort of author on that publication. She's also teaching, or has taught, a class at the Blackthorn School specifically on scrying. Again, a subject that we're probably going to get into at some length because that's an interest of mine tremendously. And she's also a hard scientist, which is kind of an interesting thing to find a magician who's interested in the hard sciences. Now, she's not the only person that I've talked to with this, but it is sort of the rare bird. There's a lot more psychologists and psychiatrists that are interested in it rather than people who are actually doing, sort of chemistry or physics and who are still interested. I guess Joseph Liszewski was supposedly a physicist as well. But so Harper, I want to welcome you. Thank you very much for being here today.
Thanks for having me on, Jason. It's a pleasure.
I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So I like to start at the beginning and just have people kind of give me a rundown of how they became interested in magic in the first place.
I don't think there was a time when I wasn't interested in magic. And my interest in magic has kind of grown and evolved in a similar way to my scientific career. If I were to put my finger on a given moment when I realized that I was basically an esotericist, it would have been during my freshman year as an undergraduate, when I discovered sort of the old rare books room in the library. And I discovered a whole section on alchemy books and Lynn Thorndike's extensive grouping of, what's it called? Magic and experimental science.
Magic and experimental science, yeah. And what university was that?
University of Colorado at Boulder.
And so they have a book room that is only allowed to certain people, or is it just an open room that you happen to discover?
Well, so they have several rare book rooms. I think I have been in one of those, but the room that is in my mind that I'm talking about is in the basement of the building. Checkered floor, just racks and racks of just dusty old things that nobody has looked at for a while. And the Thorndike collection was published in the late 50s. So, nothing probably much newer than that was down there. And there were some really old, crusty, and fascinating things in the basement.
And did you immediately jump in and go, well, I'm studying chemistry, so I'm going to get out my beakers and start doing some of this alchemy? Or was it more just an intellectual pursuit?
And, I didn't become a chemist until after that. I think I was undeclared until I was a second semester junior, which is really strange. But I was hooked up with a history department and studying Elizabethan and Tudor England. And at some point, I found myself thinking that, so I took chemistry to fulfill my science requirements. And then at the point where I decided to become a chemist, I had taken thermodynamics, and I like the math. How's that for weird? I'm marking myself as a pervert.
I actually become more fond of math as I've gotten older, and realized that it does have sort of a mystical bent to it in a way, and that sort of drew me into the subject more than when I was a kid. They would have done well to have allowed me to be mystical with numbers to make me more interested. Did you ever see the movie Donald in Mathemagic Land? I remember seeing that as a kid, but not understanding.
Yeah, I probably when I was 10 or something.
Yeah.
That's beautiful, isn't it?
Yeah, it's an interesting take on things. And I wish by that point I was so sort of like against math that it just sort of went over my head, and it was years later that I watched it again and went, wow, this is really kind of interesting and mystical. But so okay. So I mean, your interest in chemistry was largely mathematical rather than drawn into it because you'd seen those alchemy books and gone, oh, well, this is interesting.
Yeah, largely it was the initial interest was math. And then, at a much later point, I found myself doing synthetic stuff anyway. weird turn of events.
Well, tell us about your science career. I'm curious about it.
Well, the PhD is in physical chemistry, and physical chemistry is sort of like trying to understand the nuts and bolts of what molecules do when they're reacting or when they're broken apart with light. Mm-hmm. What I've turned that into in terms of a professional career is analytical devices based on really powerful pulse lasers. The pulse laser creates a plasma on the surface of a thing, and the light that's emitted, when treated appropriately, will tell you an awful lot about the composition of that material. But there's a plasma, and there's, super powerful lasers, and there's nothing wrong with that.
No, it sounds pretty fun, actually. like what a kid dreams of when they think about a science career. I'll be blasting lasers at chemicals and making plasma. Mm-hmm. So, and is that within a lab, a collegiate lab setting, or more of an industrial kind of place?
I've done both. I was an assistant research professor at the University of Denver for a little while. I also work for the government, and I can't tell you anything about that at all. It was interesting enough so that I was forbidden from traveling abroad for fear that I would get kidnapped.
Wow. So you have had a really interesting science career.
Yeah, and to kind of put the cherry on that sundae, I have more than 25 peer-reviewed publications, a patent, a book chapter, probably 75 presentations at international and national conferences.
Wow.
I'm an assistant editor at a very well-known scientific journal.
And yet you still make time for magic, and not only just that, but visionary magic, which is sort of the most right-brained aspect of magic. So how did that aspect of your life kind of mix in with the scientific aspect?
The fact that I'm interested in observing that things that other people may not notice, let me just put it like that. The fact that I've always been that person probably led me to science rather than the other way around. And so the two things, my esoteric pursuits and my scientific ones are related by that observation and by sort of the interest in using all available faculties or tools to do that.
So what sort of practical things have you done in the field of magic?
Practical, you mean like things that have physically manifested?
It's an open question, so however you want to answer it is fine. I'm just curious. Well, I guess the reason I'm asking that question is because you are a scientist, and so usually in science there's the experiment and then the result. So what sort of result-oriented things have you approached in magic?
Oh, that's a question well posed. I would say that the most significantly successful things that I have done involved a healing procedure that I applied to my sister, who is a sort of a troubled person. I recently dusted that back off for a friend whose brother was in trouble. So we'll see if it worked again.
Second time.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to me that sometimes magic is a little bit elusive in that way, and that it seems to work, and there's no question that it worked, but it doesn't always work in the same consistent way that a scientific procedure is expected to.
Well, it's a scientific procedure, if it's designed appropriately, has all of the variables controlled save one, and you can't really do that with a magical activity.
How would you approach trying to do that with a magical activity, though? Just really limit the focus of it on specific groups or something like that? Some
people try to do that, but I think that's an erroneous way to think about the whole thing, because when we do magic, the sensor that we use to sort of observe the results is our sensor suite, which is a thing I talk a lot about in my scrying class, but also it's interpreted by your brain, and your brain is really never the same place two times.
Yeah.
So it's like you can set up an experiment that's very similar to something that you've done before, but your detection system is or is not the same. So it's not like you can't really you can't do a controlled experiment in that way.
I mean, I can completely see that, and especially if there's more than one human involved in the activity, you have two people who are, completely different places.
So let me give you an example of how fraught with difficulty that is. Two people may try to communicate, but you never know if what you're thinking shows up in the other person's head.
Sure. I've had a million examples of the exact opposite happening, of me saying something that I thought was perfectly clear, and someone then saying it back to me weeks or years later, and I'm like, wow, that was so far from what I was intending to communicate, both for good or ill. Sometimes they hear something far better than what I said, but
yeah. So it's hard to do that when you're describing something that's square and black. Sure. Imagine how much more difficult that is when you're talking about feelings or impressions or results that are only marginally different than things that were ongoing already. It's really difficult.
So let's walk back a little bit through your chronology to the point where you were looking in the alchemical books in the old books room. How did that develop into sort of actively working with magic?
I would say it went through sort of a religious phase, where around that time I was introduced to a women's magical group, and it was part of an anti-rape campaign, the whole Take Back the Night thing, which is, I think college campuses still do that. But there were some local pagan women who put on a circle that was protective in nature, and they introduced us to a variety of goddesses that were more or less unfamiliar to me. And then I decided that was a religious path that I wanted to follow. And so I followed that for kind of a long time, until I want to say it was probably 2011 when a friend of mine asked me if I'd ever summoned a spirit before, a demon. He wanted to summon goetic demons. And he wanted to summon goetic demons because, like almost all people who do that, he wanted some money. And I said, well, no, but, being sort of the extreme person that you know me to be already, I said, let's do it. And that was a fascinating enough experience for me to continue to pursue such things.
And did you feel like you were successful in doing so?
Certainly scared the pants off the guy who I did it with.
And did you continue doing that, or is that something that was a more or less, that relationship with that person, was that an ongoing magical experience, or just a beginning?
That was a one and done thing. So we worked on it for 6 months maybe, because we had to, we built the magic circle, we painted it on canvas, we acquired, imagine doing ceremonial magic without any of the tools to your name. It took us a while to come up with all that. And the guy that I did it with was a Mason, so he insisted that he was going to memorize the whole ritual. And I thought, well, fine. And then it took him a couple months to do that. In the end, when we were actually performing the summoning, he got so scared he forgot the whole thing and had to read it anyway.
Sure. But I mean, I can imagine, especially if you're if you're approaching it from the perspective that you've gathered everything together and it just might work, and you've never done anything like that. I can imagine that the memorization part, it's a lot scarier audience than like a comedy club or something, and that's pretty scary for most people too. So
sometimes it is like a comedy club though.
Yeah. So I know that you've been involved in the fairy tradition of witchcraft, as well as the OTO. So where do those fall into this chronology here?
Well, let's see. The whole fairy thing was mixed up with my activities with reclaiming. Reclaiming is a sort of activist witch organization that was developed in California. The leader of this group is probably known to most people. Her name is Starhawk.
Mhm.
So most people know her. Reclaiming has a flavor of fairy in it, and so I became interested in Anderson style fairy from that perspective. So on the one hand, I did big public rituals for the reclaiming community, and I did a lot of kind of intense personal work of a more or less erotic nature with doing fairy workings.
And so were you involved in a group with that, or?
Sort of on again, off again. That was more a solitary practice than a communal one. And
so
it's
well, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, I was going to move that forward into the OTO, and I had looked for the OTO when I first got into all things esoteric. Wow, I guess that would have been mid 80s maybe. And while there was actually an OTO group in Denver, I couldn't find it because
Sure.
you know, no internet, no cell
harder,
phones. It was just hard, and I didn't find them. But I did find them when I went back to do my professorial gig, and I kind of liked it right away. The Gnostic Mass is gorgeous. As soon as I saw the Mass, I knew I wanted to participate in that. And so I hooked up with the local OTO at that point, and so I'm still there.
I'd actually love to hear your perspective on it. I've had a couple of guests on here that have had less favorable things to say about the Gnostic Mass. So what do you love about it, and why?
Well, maybe I like it because I was, my upbringing is Christian.
So it resembled a service in some ways?
Yeah, so it's modeled after the Greek Orthodox Mass, basically. And well, with one very notable addition, no Greek Orthodox Mass has naked priestess. That's probably the best part, right? It's the inclusion of women in this sort of religious undertaking.
Empowering women, or theoretically empower. I think some of the people who I've had who've been less favorable toward it feel like it's objectifying women. But I think that's a subjective construct in people's minds, that whether it's.
I think in point of fact, the priestess drives that ritual.
Oh yeah, for sure.
So the priestess, let's say, brings the priest back to life. The priestess and the priest together consecrate all the elements. They have, a sort of representation of a sexual act. And then everybody gets to stand up in front of their brothers and say, there's no part of me that's not of the gods. And so, that is really a very powerful thing. And yeah, so the woman doesn't have as many lines as the priest. So some people get wrapped around the axle about that. What the priestess says is way cooler. I mean, I have to say that.
I mean, it's certainly a powerful. I mean, so powerful that witchcraft borrowed it for a decade or so.
Oh yeah,
much of it anyway.
Right.
So the I guess the question that people have about it is that yes, the woman is featured more prominently or the priestess is featured more prominently than the priest, and the priestess actually begins the whole thing and does a sort of number of circumambulations or serpentine circumambulations at the beginning. But even that, I think, if you're looking at it from like a sort of reactionary perspective, you can see that as, again, just more the male gaze, and the priestess is just sort of putting on a show for the men. But from internally, from having been a part of it, what's your perspective is that you felt empowered by it?
Oh, I definitely do. I will say, So in some ways, it is a product of when it was written. Crowley wrote it in, I want to say 1911. I'm sure there are people who will hear this who will call me up and say, okay, Harper.
Yeah.
But it was, you know, somewhere around 1910, kind of post-Victorian. It was before the Roaring Twenties. I mean, the notion of actually involving a woman at all in this sort of religious operation was really huge. And so when properly historically placed, it's stunningly radical. And it, you know, sure, we can look at it now and we can throw stones at it appropriately, I think. And all of us want to write more masses.
Right.
And that's
well,
sort of in the plans.
I've actually performed the mass as the priestess, you know, with a woman priest. So we did that, and then that same priestess and we wrote a mass called the Mass of Babylon that we performed a few times. So you know, we already tried to, like, you know, mess around with the the polarities within the ritual way back 20 years ago or so. So but I'm sure with what's that?
Oh, I was just going to say that's actually a hobby for many of us.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Messing around with the various parameters in it to see what will happen. Of course, we don't call those an official. That's not an official OTO event, right?
I think we did do it as official OTO events, but not an official celebration of the mass.
Right.
I think I've actually been all the roles in that ritual.
Good.
Both children, the deacon, the priest, and the priestess. So
you know, I know the priest role, but I've never done it.
You should soon find a man who's willing to be a priestess, or just do it with a woman. You know, who cares? You can be the priest. It doesn't really matter. I think that's one of the.
How about you be my priestess?
Anytime. Where do you live?
Minnesota.
Oh, that's pretty far from here, but yeah, you know, if I get up there, I actually have a relationship with your body up there, because that was the first place I went when I was promoting my first book was Leaping Laughter, and I went to Magus Books, and then I did a presentation at Leaping Laughter. So,
that's so cool.
Again, like 20 years ago at this point. So you teach a class on scrying, so I want to dig into your, you know, I don't want to let that me just jibber jabber at you and us not discuss this stuff. So what is your approach to scrying, and what if someone were to take your scrying class, what are they going to get out of it for to begin with?
Well, the overall purpose of me teaching the class is that I think magicians kind of have this predilection to forget they have a body. So when you hear people talking about doing a goetic conjuration, they talk about what they see. And the notion of conjuring some spirit to full visible manifestation, it's the goal. But that's not the only way to get the information. And people forget that, you know, the smells and sounds and pressures and all that kind of stuff can be useful to the beginning of this imaginative trance that is scrying, and it can hold you there, you know, way better than staring at something and not seeing anything. So there's that. So goal number one is to remind magicians that they actually are not eyeballs floating around in the world. And kind of goal number two is the establishment of some degree of doubt about how well your senses and the brain that runs your senses is representative of the real world, because they're so limited. So we talk a lot about the limitations of you know, of your senses. We compare them with how animals work, and then kind of what would be present if we had the full scientific suite, you know, which is obviously different. But there's a whole lot of information out there that we just never access. So what's real, basically?
Which sort of inner sense do you feel like is your primary inner sense?
I have a tendency to get going in my trances when I feel things on my back and on my neck. So it's related to pressure for me. Although I'm getting more and more visual as I practice.
Do you feel like you can have a successful evocation? You mentioned that you had one early on where there isn't a visual component to it. Was there not a visual component to the first evocation that you did?
There was a visual component to it, but it was really weak.
Hmm.
The auditory part, and there was a temperature change in the room, but there was a visual component to that. I did see the spirit that we called. It wasn't in the place where we tried to call it. I will assure you that happens pretty frequently.
I think it's the rule. Honestly, I mean, why would they completely do what you want them to do?
Right? Because no, that's not how it works. And so, the visual part comes and goes for me. I've had really astonishingly successful scrying events where it was all auditory.
Do you tend to utilize a scrying device, a mirror or a crystal ball or any kind of object like that as a part of it?
Sure. I have a crystal ball. It's very occluded. So one of the things that I do to get the visual stuff going is I will rotate the actual crystal ball until I can see something, a form. And that's just the pattern recognition part of my brain grabbing onto whatever information's there.
Right.
But anything that can help establish the trance and keep you in trance is the thing that you want to do. So crystal balls are great for that. I make curved black mirrors that are also really useful. In a pinch, the darkened screen of my cell phone works great. Right now, I'm interested in bowl scrying and water, but whatever. Be flexible.
And do you feel like those all take you to the same place, or are there, because I in the descriptions of sort of classic scrying, which really, I mean, early 20th century, late 19th century is where they were really starting to like try and give people instructions on this. It seems like they're suggesting something that is quite different than what most people I've interacted with actually do. It's sort of like they want you to, it's not a trance state, it's not an altered state, it's just like something just begins to bubble up inside the ball. Do you think that that's sort of a blind alley, or do you think that there are different kinds of scrying that people can approach?
I think there are different kinds. A lot of the early practitioners that described that sort of it just happens, we're actually using a child as a medium.
Right.
And so
or a young woman.
Yeah, a young woman, a young man, someone who's ritually pure, right, in a way that we savage old farts never will be. But kids are really imaginative, and they'll pick up on kind of what you want them to see. I think one of the things that modern day practitioners have to get over is the fact that we don't have help like that. So I would say, without having thought a whole lot about it, that the whole establishment of some kind of trance or imaginative trance or something is largely to make up for the lack of a mediumistic helper.
Well, it's interesting because I actually have I have 3 children, all of whom are quite imaginative, and my son, actually the youngest, is like borderline mediumistic in some of the things, but I feel a little weird about involving him in occult ritual, just because I know that it can be traumatic, and it can be unexpected things happen fairly regularly. So I feel a little funny going, hey, let's go, you and me go into a dark room with candles, and I'm gonna try and have you communicate with something strange. I've actually shied away from it, even though like he really probably would love it in some ways, but I don't want to scar him. So I haven't.
I want to say that, you know, people 400 years ago were less concerned with the ethics of, you know, things like child labor.
Yeah.
or a frightening child labor for that matter.
Yeah, well, I mean, I also, I think a lot, you know, a lot of the sort of magical activities of a professional magic worker, we don't know the ins and outs of what exactly was going on. It's quite possible that they actually had helpers that were sort of amongst the populace, little boys and girls that were sort of trained by them to do certain things in certain ways, not necessarily to not have genuine visions, but just sort of like they'd already been through the rigmarole a few times with pretty much everyone in the neighborhood because no one was watching those kids, you know, so like they could do that with them. Whereas if I started inviting kids from the neighborhood around to come look in my crystal ball, that would get even more trouble going, right? Well,
yeah, I foresee in your future some difficulty.
yeah, not a great idea. So when you're doing scrying work, do you follow a specific kind of ritual pattern within that, or are you more just free form scrying? How does your ritual life around scrying work?
Well, you know, it's evolving kind of constantly. I would say that for maybe 5 years, I was doing the whole trithemian drawing spirits into crystals thing. And I think that's the full up version of that and the seven spheres version of that, both are very effective. I have been fiddling around with some tech from the PGM that I like very much. And more
that has a lot of scrying tech in it. Which ones are you playing around with?
I like the ones that are associated, the technique that's associated with the Typhon initiation.
Okay, yeah, the wrapping the ivy around your head and laying on the rooftop kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And have you approached that in kind of a full-on way, or? Yeah, and do you find that how does that compare with trithemius for you?
In my experience, and I'll say that I've probably maybe done 7 of these events, you know, the sort of classic PGM typhonic one. I probably have done 7 of them, and they're raw and they're very physical. Whereas the trithemian thing in general, less scary, I guess. Like, and by scary I mean not like a horror movie, but like getting the creeps or feeling like there's some flesh and blood thing in the room with you, maybe.
Interesting.
But that probably has to do with the fact that I'm summoning different kinds of beasties with the PGM right than I ever was with the 7 spheres approach.
And you think those beasties are inherently more disturbing to the atmosphere than the trithemian angels?
It's difficult to say because I don't know them as well. So I mean, you know, I'm used to goetic critters, and have called many of the Theurgia spirits, many angels, you know, planetary spirits, that sort of thing. And all of that, especially anything having to do with planetary sorts of entities, I just know that territory, so it's less disturbing. To call sort of gods and titans from the PGM is a different thing altogether, and they're unfamiliar to me. And like I said, my body gets more involved than it used to, and I suppose those 2 things together make it a little more unnerving for me.
Unnerving in a good way, or unnerving in a like, I don't know if I can continue down this pathway?
Oh no, I like it a whole lot.
You like? Okay. I guess to me, I feel like when you're dealing with something that you're unfamiliar with, there is a more potent effect on your psychology than when you're dealing with something that you are familiar with. So do you think that there'll come a point when they become just your friends in the same way as the other ones?
Wow, I can't predict. I don't know.
You're not sure yet? So I mean, is this a fairly new avenue that you're going down?
I've been up to it for a couple of years, but yeah, it's new.
Okay, so I always like to ask these questions about people's beliefs, but I think you'll be an interesting person to ask because you do have a scientific background. So you mentioned that you feel very comfortable with the planetary entities, but like the planetary entities involve a worldview. Somewhat, you can sort of see part of it behind me.
Yeah, right.
That is fairly different from the way that we actually approach our understanding of the way that the world works today. Do you feel like you need to change your perspective on the universe in order to work with it, or you just sort of go, how do you put those pieces together in yourself?
That's a good question, actually. And so let me go back to the really tired explanation that people give for understanding particle physics.
Okay.
So light can be perceived as either a particle or a wave. And everybody knows that. Everybody has heard that, but they don't know exactly what that means.
Sure.
So light behaves both ways all the time. You get to experience light as particle when you set up an experiment that looks for it as a particle, and you get to experience it as a wave when you do that. So if you have an interferometric experiment for light, you will see it as a wave. If you're looking at radioactive decay, it's really easy to see it as a particle. It has to do with the model that you use to set up the experiment. And I want to say that the spirits are really similar. If you want to pretend that the spirits are your psychology, you can set up an experiment that will show that to you. If you want to think that the spirits are, let's see, kind of admired in the 15th century, 14th century, you can prove that to yourself too.
Well, I guess I don't need it to be proved in either direction. I'm just curious, we live in a world where, we know that the Earth rotates around the sun, as do the planets, and that when they're, like, for instance, everybody for the past, I don't know, decade or so has been obsessed with Mercury retrograde. We know physically that's not even a thing. It's just an appearance based on our relationship while we're both circling the sun. So nonetheless, that affects people on material levels all the time. They say, "Oh, my plane always is late when Mercury's in retrograde." And whatever. Everyone can live the universe they want to live in. It's fine. But from the perspective of you're calling upon a being you see them as a being. It's not something that's in your mind, right? It's something that you're trying to connect with out in the world. It, in the ontology and the universal structure that we live in, what does it have to do with Jupiter or Mercury? Why would it have that as its being? Because it's not. The Jupiter is a planet.
Oh, I gotcha. So put your mind back in Agrippa and realize that when Agrippa talks about this stuff, he's talking about characteristics of things, right? So things that are related to Saturn are kind of related to boundaries, and they're dull and they're heavy, and they're, lead is the metal that represents it, and all of the incenses that Agrippa discusses and they move forward into 777 are, kind of either funereal or just plain out stinky. But the point there is that the planet is actually sort of a directory for all those characteristics. So yeah, it's the thing that rotates the sun, but it's also the set of characteristics that have been given to it by all the practitioners who've ever dealt with it. So the fact that we no longer have a geocentric picture of the solar system, I think, maybe that's a 5% on all of the things that people ascribe to a planet.
Sure, no, I'm not questioning that. Okay. But ultimately, those are all human things too. The slowness, the perception of different elements, and those things don't exist without us, you know. Like, I mean, or they can exist without us, but they aren't defined in the same way without human consciousnus being a part of it.
But
I guess
but that's not entirely true. And let me interrupt you just for a sec.
Sure, yeah.
So Saturn is slow because as we see it in the sky, it's slow.
Yeah.
And yeah, okay, you can say that that doesn't matter if no humans are looking at it, but it's still slow.
So Cassiel is the angel of Saturn in some systems. Does he see him, or it see itself as being of Saturn, or is that something that we put onto that, but that intelligence is there without Saturn being necessarily a part of it?
I would say that that's a human attribution, but I don't know, so that's a good
question to ask Cassia.
Exactly, right. And so, call him up on the phone and find out.
Cassiel might be kind though and decide to, just play along and just feel sorry for us humans for having such a weird perspective on things. Be like, yes, I'm of Saturn.
So you never know if the spirits are telling you the truth, but you don't know if other people are telling you the truth either.
Sure. So do you work in like a formal temple most of the time? I know the temple for PGM is probably a little bit more pared down than the high goetic temple, but do you still work in a special room or a special place to do that kind of stuff?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have a room in my house devoted to shrines and workings.
And so you work in that same room, even though there's lots of shrines to all kinds of beings in there, that you'll still do your practical work in there?
Sure.
I'm finding that to be more the rule than the exception. There are definitely some people who have like a shrine room, and then they have like a working room that's separate from it. But you have to have a lot of rooms in order to be able to do that, right?
Right. I'm probably like every other practitioner, though. I have my main shrine that's in the living room. It's on the mantelpiece over my fireplace, and then I have individual shrines to individual deities. We all do that.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, none of mine are in my living room because my kids would destroy them in a second. But I do have a lot of shrines in my space. Let's talk about the tech of visions for a minute here. I know I've already kind of like gone into scrying a little bit already, but so when you're working with an entity, you say that feeling is the first, and then auditory is probably the second most, with visual coming in the third most. What about smell? Because I've been hearing a lot of people talk about smell recently. Does that impact your work at all?
Oh, yeah. I think that can be so visceral and so incredibly disturbing. Because
are you usually using incense?
Often. And
so I find that when I'm burning incense, that's the only olfactory experience I have is the incense.
Well, so imagine if you're, burning tons of myrrh, and then all of a sudden you smell something different. It's very strong and it's very disturbing. But yeah, I mean, what great information.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, that's definitely a channel of information that would be hard to refuse to accept. That and temperature are probably the most, if you're feeling those things, something's changed for sure. So in terms of the visual aspect, I know you said that it's sort of a little bit shaky for you sometimes. But when you're experiencing an entity visually, do you experience that they're actually speaking to you with their mouths, or is it they're present and then information is coming into you?
It's almost universally that latter. In fact, I don't recall ever having seen a spirit's mouth move.
Interesting.
That's a good question. I never thought.
That's going to have to go into my regular question file from now on.
It should. That's a good one.
Okay, so when the information enters into your consciousness, what is that experience like for you?
Well, usually there's a way. So there's some amount of time well, sorry to use technical language here, but there's almost a period of calibration where I'm firstly getting out of my humdrum sort of reality, getting into the space for the ritual. And then there's another shift that happens when I'm actually hearing something or encountering something. And then
about how long
once
is that
I'm
space between beginning the ritual and the actual encounter?
You mean time-wise?
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
Just how it feels.
Can be long.
Yeah, I think
Some
people
of
don't realize that. That's an important thing to.
Yeah, and so there's part of the issue there is that you get bored,
Mm-hmm.
right? If nothing's happening, it's sort of inevitable that you start worrying about, well, what am I going to have for dinner? Or the laundry that's in the dryer, is it dry? But it's very necessary that you have patience to let these things kind of evolve in their own time, because there is no way to rush them. That's not what you're there to do.
In your early working, your first working of a goetic nature, you were working with a partner. Do you usually work with a partner, or are you working alone most of the time now?
I've done an awful lot of work with partners. So there was the Masonic guy who was my first magical partner, in ceremonial magic anyway. And then I lived with a person who was very into this stuff, and we were working together for 6 years, I guess, 7. I mean, I'm talking about Rufus Opus, of
I
course.
think everybody knows who you're talking about.
So I was Rufus Opus's partner until I wasn't. I have a couple of magical partners that I'm working with right now, neither one of which want to be spoken of in public.
But so you're still primarily doing a partner type magic. Do you ever do it by yourself?
Mm-hmm.
And what's the difference for you in those experiences?
I don't get all tied up in this thing that people complain about, right? Lots of people who come to my scrying class complain because there's nobody there to read the script or to perform the conjuration.
Mm-hmm.
But I actually like doing both things at once. And I suppose it's not coincidental. It's more step by step. So I'll perform the conjuration and then I'll watch for a while, and then I'll tune the conjuration and then I'll watch for a while. And I like that very much. But I guess the tech that I'm trying to develop right now is scrying during a bodywork session. And my bodywork partner, who goes by Jezebel Pride on Facebook, we actually will set up a summoning or a conjuration. It's probably more, it's not so ceremonial as things I've done. We will call an entity or we'll call a couple, and then I will get really relaxed and she'll help me do that. And really trippy and amazing things happen during these sessions.
And so you're going into full visionary states while undergoing body work, and how does that compare with just working in a by yourself or with a partner in a just regular ceremonial sense? More powerful, less powerful? What kind of information comes through?
When and I'm not sure if anyone else has this sort of experience, but when I'm that relaxed, the manifestation is really clear. I'm able to have full-on conversations with my invisible friends. The question answering is better, I would say. And it actually doesn't take as long.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that you like to do the ritual yourself, and I've leaned towards that way for a long time. And my feeling is that one of the things that for ritual for me is that I approach ritual from a very energetic perspective. So I'm connecting with a different sort of wavelength as I'm doing a ritual, or as I mean, partially that's because I have a lot of like audio technology and stuff that I utilize as a part of it. So I mean, like, there's I've got a whole other thing going on, but because of the fact that I'm doing a ritual, but at the same time I'm doing this energy stuff in myself, it's like it's not the same thing as just reading a ritual and having someone else go into a trance at the same time. It's a totally different kind of experience. So I could see the body work being that way in a way too, because you're like, the body work is putting you into a different kind of space, and I'm imagining that you're using essential oils and stuff that are related to the energies that you're trying to connect with, or maybe you're not, but a place to go if you're not doing that. But you're connecting with it on a level from the very beginning, so it's more natural and more just sort of you're going to that place, right?
Yeah, I think that's pretty well described. It sounds as though you've had a similar experience.
Yeah, well, not with body work per se, but with various kinds of. I mean, I don't want to get into me too much. Everyone knows about me, or they don't, but they will someday. Perhaps when I'm on your show and you're actually talking to me about me instead of about
soon.
So, I want to go back around to the visual aspect of things for a second, just 'cause I'm always curious about this. When you're seeing an entity, do you find that they are the same size that you are, larger than you, or like little because you're seeing them in another place?
Oh, it depends. Sometimes they're enormous.
When you say enormous, what do you mean by that? Like larger than the world, or just hundreds of feet tall, or 50 feet tall?
Well, there was one, there was a scrying trance I was in not very long ago where I was next to the leg of the creature, and it was like, an architectural pillar. So sometimes they seem really big,
right?
And other times they have they kind of have a feel of the martial arts imaginary techie opponent, right? So when you do sword work and you're doing individual sword work, you're supposed to imagine your opponent as being your size. So there's some maybe I bring that to bear and just can't get rid of it, but many of the spirits are of a similar
about
dimension.
Human size.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I hear a lot of answers to that question, and I always find it interesting. So let's talk for a second about practical magic. I sort of mentioned it a little bit with results oriented stuff, but is healing the only thing that you've done with practical magic, or are there other things as well?
Oh gosh, no. That I brought that up because it turned out to be one of the most effective magical acts I've ever performed. Other very effective magical acts that I've done have involved cursing people, have involved finding lost items. Maybe I'll just leave it there.
so I mean, you've had a reasonable range of practical work that you've conducted over the years. How often does that play a part? I know that you are more of a devotional nature these days, but how often do you find yourself availing yourself of magical activity to obtain something?
I suppose, the extra things that I just described happen about once a year. And I don't generally do those things for myself. So when somebody appears to have a need or comes to me asking questions, I'll do that sort of work.
Do you do that with their permission, with them, or is it something that you just do surreptitiously and let it play out?
Well, the healing rituals have been surreptitious. When I find lost things, I find lost things because people ask me to. And when I perform curse work for people, it's because they want me to.
Okay, I'm going to stay away from the curse work because I know that's very that can be. But do you have an anecdote about finding a lost object that would be interesting to share?
Yeah. So when I was hanging around with Rufus, a mutual friend of ours had misplaced some dangerous and expensive devices, and he was concerned that they may have been stolen. And we summoned Ushiel, who is a Theurgia spirit, and Ushiel helped us locate those things. And I don't remember it because I was very deep in trance, but I evidently described the inside of his storage locker to a T.
Interesting.
Mm.
So you have a amnesiac experiences a lot in trance, or no? Yeah. So that's an interesting sort of area of consciousness to be in. Do you, at that point, are they speaking directly with the entity usually, and you're just sort of channeling, or are you still relaying things but just don't remember it?
Probably a mixture of both of those things.
Do you feel changed after those experiences? Do you feel like it's hard to come back to normalcy after that, or is it just shaking it off?
Sometimes it's very hard for me to come back.
Because that's considered to be a fairly high level of depth of for want of a better word, hypnotic trance. And very often when a person is capable of doing those sorts of things, they are actually very transformed by those experiences. So do you feel like there's been negative consequences of going really deep and working with entities of questionable moral nature or intent?
Well, why don't we go all the way back to comparing this stuff to a scientific experiment?
Okay, yes.
So it's hard to say because there's not a version of me around who hasn't done these things.
Right.
So, probably the answer to your question is yes, I have been transformed. But, I was also transformed when I realized I could ski black diamonds.
That is an interesting realization, and probably somewhat similar in some ways, right?
So anything really intense that we do, and having children is definitely on this list of things. Sure. They change you forever.
One of the things that I remember in my conversation fairly recently with Rufus Opus was that he feels that magical ritual is an inherently evolutionary activity because of the fact that you're sort of reaching past your normal consciousness. You're going to be moving in a positive direction. Do you see that as being inherently true? Like no matter what you're working with, you're going to be improved? Or could you be unimproved by working with certain things too much?
Oh, I definitely think that we could be degraded in our workings.
Yeah. So do you try and balance between different kinds of spirits that you work with?
No, I just make sure that I'm really clean when I'm done. And sometimes it takes a while to get that way. But
so what are your cleaning processes?
Well, first I have to be back all the way, and that's sometimes pretty hard. That involves like, talking and eating and walking and just being a normal, kind of coming back to normal human functioning.
Sure.
But I would say, I think I'm not an LBRP person. Folks who are listening will probably find that abhorrent, but
that's the lesser ritual of the pentagram from the Golden Dawn, and Alice really adopted it as well.
No, but I think
you don't use that at all.
Well, I certainly know how to do it. I've been okay. I know how to do it, but
you're forced to do it a little bit in OTO. So yeah. But that's not your go-to ritual for cleansing at all.
No, I come out more or less the way I go in. So there's bathing, there's some mantra, there's praying. And my cat, actually.
My cat just came in the room and meowed right before you said that. Who do you pray to? Who's Harper Feist's deity of choice for cleansing?
At this moment, Hecate is my patron.
And so, I mean, she's a goddess she's a very complicated goddess. I have a relationship with Hecate myself that is very complex. I don't know that I'd go to her for cleansing, with all due respect to both you and her, but she tends to carry me into places and throw me into unsafe territory rather than being a nuzzling mother to me.
But she takes Persephone down and she brings Persephone back.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, yeah. So yeah, I guess that makes sense. Yeah, sure.
And then there's the whole guardian angel thing, right? So really, I'm relying on both of these beings, Hecate and my what I perceive as my holy guardian angel, to conduct me safely through these workings.
And okay, this is an interesting question. Like, the holy guardian angel, what part does that play within your visionary work? Like, where does that play out?
He's kind of a messenger. I establish direct contact with most of the spirits that I talk to, but oftentimes the holy guardian angel is the intermediary. And I suppose, it's a little bit like Hecate's tendency to be an intercessor. I don't know. And there are some ways in which she's an intermediary in the same way.
Yeah, very much so.
Mm-hmm.
And so the holy guardian angel is not a formal component of anything that you're working with. You just feel like it's a presence that sort of guides the process sometimes as it needs to be.
Some of the rituals actually call the holy guardian angel to prepare a feast or to prepare the ritual working. So it's part of prep work.
What rituals are you referring to? Just
the presence of the HGA is often invoked in the modified Trithemian ritual.
You're talking about the 7 spheres?
Mm-hmm. And versions of it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we modified that a lot over time.
And so, does it feel like 7 spheres is kind of your work as well, or is that something that is specifically his work?
Oh no, he developed all that before I showed up. My individual work is it's strange to say this, but it's kind of heading back toward witchcraft, so sorcery.
Sure. I mean, the PGM feels very, very earthy and connected with that sort of ancient sorcery. I know what you mean.
Yeah. It's weird to say that though, because everything else I do is really pretty CM. But more and more I'm disappearing down the rabbit hole of sorcery.
I don't think they necessarily have to be in conflict with one another. I mean, they're each has its own sort of place and things.
Oh, I think.
And certainly, I mean, Skinner's work kind of pretty well develops the fact that a lot of the PGM stuff actually really becomes the Solomonic stuff in a lot of ways.
Oh, right. And there are PGM rituals that got sucked, wholly into Crowley's work.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right. The headless got to be Samic eventually.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of like his central the heart of his work in many ways is right out of the PGM, although quite modified to his own taste. But yeah, I mean reading through the Chaldean oracles recently, I realized, I mean a few years ago, but I realized that so much of Crowley is directly out of that Chaldean oracles too. Like I mean, so many of the sort of aphorisms that he says are actually quotes from the Chaldean oracles. And I don't know, Magick, I think Ruth Magick, I might be murdering her name. Apologies if you ever watch this, Ruth Magick. But her translation is fascinating to read because it's so different than the translation that Westcott published. That it's almost unrecognizable, and yet you can see it in there. But like so many of the things that Crowley latched onto in that, like if Magick's translation is more accurate, like he's sort of, a lot of it just sort of evaporates because it's actually much more of a specific technical language than what he was being taught by that information. It's really interesting to watch.
That's true.
The 19th century occultists really were operating with so little, and they produced so much interesting, wonderful stuff. And I hate to see them all get sort of like cast away just because they were wrong about some stuff. But
right.
Unfortunately, I don't know where that's
going. You hear Crowley's Egyptology always thrown into question because he read Budge.
Right.
So the same sort of thing.
Yeah.
But we know a whole lot more now than Crowley ever dreamed.
Yeah, and then we look back a couple generations before that, and they were just sort of making things up about what Egypt was about. So we're and in fact, I just was reading Paul Hewson's book on tarot, and like it's fairly clear that a lot of the tarot sort of standard kind of readings of them come from Etiela, however you pronounce that, who was just sort of like operating in a vacuum. I mean, he may have had some contact with somebody, but like those are sort of pretend Egyptian things that were not based on anything, and yet they've slipped into their what the tarot is. So it's quite interesting to how much things have evolved, and how much like to try and pretend like all of that stuff needs to just be discarded is I think really very self-destructive in a lot of ways.
No, we don't want to do that. I mean, for two obvious reasons. Like those things are effective in their place, but also they're our past, and it woe be unto those who flush that sort of thing. That wouldn't serve us at all. We just need to develop new things based on new information.
Right. I think that Crowley's Gnostic Mass was actually an example of him trying to do something that would sort of honor a more scientific perspective on an occult, alchemical, magical ceremony. He wrote it with the specific intention of not having any sort of metaphysical requirements in order to understand it and to appreciate it. So again, it's a shame that people are starting to discard that because they feel like it's too sexist or something. But,
I think it's really important to place things in a historical context. And I'm not saying that we should forgive Crowley for being a kind of post-Victorian gentleman, but we have to realize he lived in a given time. He couldn't do anything different.
Well, and we all have things about ourselves that are imperfect, and when you do a lot of writing, you write a lot of stupid things, and
wait a minute.
If someone were
to resemble that remark.
If someone were to go back through like my first couple of books, they could find a few things that I know are not true in them, that I stated as if they were cardinal truth. So, and what are you going to do? you change over time, and sometimes you change for the better, and sometimes you change for the worse. So I want to ask you one final question, which is, if you were to give a piece of advice to a person who is just getting interested in magic, scrying, or any sort of magical activities, what would be like the most important nutshell thing that you could give to them?
Get out there and try it. Keep good records, but get out there and try it. Don't just read about it. Go do. You're not a magician unless you do things.